describe the state of the union for marketing sales alignment?
I always like to say sales is from Mars and marketing is from Venus. And I think that fundamental difference, frankly causes misalignment at a lot of different companies. They have different personality styles. They got into the jobs for different reasons. They get measured differently, right? And the result is that, it's pretty bad at most companies. And I think it results in problems that are, fundamentally, I think, that are outdated, inefficient and expensive, and not predictable. So, first of all, outdated, right? I mean, you've heard this plenty of times before, but the whole digital transformation has led to a very fundamental change in the way that our buyers like to research and make purchases. The shift from information scarcity to information abundance. And as a result, today's buyers want to engage with sales much later than they ever did before, until they essentially have as much information as the salesperson does. And they can do that because of information abundance, right? That is a new buying process. And the traditional misalignment between sales and marketing is making companies not well aligned to match to that buying, right? So it's outdated. Second of all, I think it's expensive and inefficient, right? When sales and marketing don't get along or aren't aligned, sales doesn't really rely on marketing for lead generation, and they do a lot of their own prospecting. And it's a really bad idea to have expensive $250,000 plus salespeople cold calling. And it's even less of a good idea in this new world where the buyers don't want to engage with sales till much later on. And then I think the third problem, like I say, is it's really not predictable. Predictability is I think, an undervalued metric in business. Every CFO, though, wants their revenue process to be predictable. And the problem is sales, if you only rely on the sales team to make their forecasts, that they're becoming increasingly less and less accurate because they're engaging with buyers later in the funnel, which means actually in some cases sales cycles are getting shorter. And to really predict future revenue, as marketing is becoming a more important piece of the whole process, marketing has to become part of that equation. And if they're not, right, if sales and marketing aren't aligned, you fundamentally have a broken forecasting process. And that's not good for anybody either. So it's pretty bad, I think.
To get started, what steps or phases do you suggest chief sales or marketing executives follow when they plan the marketing sales alignment process?
I think to build sales and marketing alignment from scratch, when you recognize that it's pretty bad at most companies, you have to start with fundamentally rebuilding marketing credibility, a little bit. It's interesting. I mean, if you look at the sales process, it's very easy to measure the output of what sales does. It's the revenue on the board. And it's really, frankly, sometimes hard to measure what all the sales activities are. And marketing is actually the exact opposite, right? Marketing, it's really easy to see marketing activity, right? You see the checks going out the door in terms of expenses, you see what the people are doing, and it's pretty hard to start to measure the output of it. And that sort of asymmetry is, I think, the first thing that you need to tackle to start to try to, build sales and marketing alignment. And that is, first and foremost, I think, upon the marketing executive to change their language, to change how they even think about the world, right? Don't be the arts and crafts person who's coming to the head of sales talking about what the trade show booth looks like or the color of the new brochure, right? Start being that marketing executive that comes to the head of sales talking about the metrics they care about, pipeline, revenue, right, and so on. And as I'll talk in a sec, this is a journey. But the first thing, as I said, is build marketing credibility by changing your language. I think second is that sales marketing alignment needs to come from the top, i.e. the head of sales and the head of marketing, really making a commitment to doing this together. Now sometimes that might be forced on them by the CEO or something like that. But, honestly, the biggest piece of advice that I have for many companies that need to start solving this is head of sales, head of marketing, go grab a beer together. Go do a golf game together, right? I mean, the relationship is often so frayed, that literally just by getting into a social cadence, I think you start to set that top-down alignment. And then the third thing I think that needs to happen is that you have to recognize this is not a transformation that's going to happen overnight. You have to think big, but then start small, get some quick wins, and then, as I like to say, then hold victory parades to celebrate those little wins. So what does that mean, right? Usually, the first thing you want to do to kind of start to repair this relationship is, if you can find a small set of salespeople, maybe it's one salesperson, right, with sponsorship from the executive, and say, we're going to change the process we work with you, right? We're going to maybe implement some lead scoring, right, just for your leads, or have this new inbound marketing program where we're generating more high quality leads that we're going to fast track over to you, right? Pick that sort of small little win with small person, right? And then, pick that person carefully so that as they start to see, wow, this is better. I'm getting more high quality leads from sales and I'm not wasting my time talking to people who don't want to talk to me, right? Then make them your evangelist. And so that, because what you ultimately want is them to say, I just blew my quota out and marketing's my hero. And then they start to tell their buddy, and they tell their buddy, and they tell their buddy. I like to sort of say what you're trying to ultimately do is you're trying to leave breadcrumbs. As a marketing person, you're trying to leave breadcrumbs so that the salespeople are finding these, and ultimately you want them coming on your door, to knock on your door and say, hey, can I get some of that Steve had? Right? Because that's really good. So I think that's probably the most important first step you've got to take along this kind of general mantra of think big, start small, fast results.
What are the biggest mistakes that you've seen that negatively impact the marketing sales alignment?
I've seen sort of two mistakes, right? A big one, and then I'll talk about a small one. The big one is at the core just fundamentally not communicating to each other well enough and listening essentially in the other person's language. and really what I mean by that is even in a well-aligned marketing and sales organization, what you're going to find is that, and what I recommend is that they aren't focused on necessarily the exact same metrics in terms of how they're measuring their own performance. And actually, as we'll talk about, I think that's a good thing, right? But the result of that is sometimes what can happen is you could have the sales team say, I don't have enough business to work on to make my number, but the marketing team is saying, well, but we've been generating enough pipeline, right? We've been achieving our goal, right? So therefore, sales, this must clearly be your issue, right? Because we achieved enough pipeline, and you can get into that dynamic, even a well-aligned organization. But fundamentally, what's going on there is marketing isn't really, I think, fundamentally listening to what their counterpart's saying, right? Something's causing them to say, I don't have enough to sell, which means that as a single team, right, you need to think about a reaction. And it happens from the sales side too, right? I've sometimes seen, marketing kind of almost, because remember, marketing I think has further headlights out, right? So you might be in a scenario where sales is all happy. Hey, we just blew our number out for the quarter. Sales is going great. And you might have marketing saying, guys, next quarter, I'm seeing some red flags. There's not enough pipeline being created, for the future. And marketing can probably see that better. And if the mistake is sales not to listen to that, right? Because they're thinking, oh, everything's hunky-dory, really good. So the net of that is you're thinking about the world differently. And that's the inherent sales is from Mars, marketing is from Venus, right? You think about the world differently, but you got to find that way to communicate and really understand where the other team is coming from to problem solve around it. So I think that's the big mistake. The small mistake is, frankly, just a small little tiny example of that. But I've seen this happen where companies introduce something like a lead scoring methodology to try to get better quality sales leads, over to the sales team. And when you do that well, what actually happens is you're sending fewer leads to sales because you're sending better ones, right? And if a company if you haven't set that expectation, up front, all of a sudden, you could end up in a very bad place where lead scoring gets a really negative reputation because everyone's just complaining, where'd all my leads go, right? As opposed to make sure you let them know, hey, this is going to be fewer but much more high quality leads. Expect that, and then value and appreciate it when it comes.
What are the most important metrics to track and review to ensure alignment practices are healthy and on track?
Well, at the most fundamental core, I think, and I've sort of alluded to this before, marketing and sales, I don't believe, should be tracking to the exact same metrics. Right? I've definitely heard people say, oh, marketing should only be measured on revenue because that's what sales is measured on. I think, fundamentally, you want to peel it back, and I like to see companies measuring, marketing really for kind of all the different stages and pieces of the revenue process. So to maybe really explain what that means, right? First and foremost, I think companies need to be fairly rigorous about defining the stages of what I call the revenue cycle. Right? Most companies have a sales cycle, right? And they know it goes from discovery to evaluation to negotiation to purchase, and they track movement through those stages. What companies need to do is say, I'm going to have that exact same rigor, but applied to the entire revenue process. Right, starting with awareness, to people entering in my funnel as a raw name, to becoming engaged, to maybe being qualified as a possible future buyer, to being actually identified as a possible marketing qualified lead, to being actually qualified and passed over to sales, to being accepted and turned into an opportunity, and kind of run from there. You might have your own revenue cycle, but you're going to have something that looks kind of like that. And then once you have that defined, the metrics really come down to, I think, the 4 metrics that matter. For each of those stages, you want to measure, first of all, your balance, or your reach, right? So essentially, what's the size of that inventory, right? And so if I am measuring the inventory of my active prospects that I'm being nurtured, that are actually still engaging with me, that's my inventory of future possible customers, right? Is that inventory going up or down? Is actually a really interesting predictive measure for the future health of the business. Second is flow. So what's the movement from one stage to the next? That's actually turns out really hard to measure in a CRM system because it can't tell you how many people changed from this status to that status last month. But it's important to try to figure out how you're going to track in the business over time. Third, conversion, pretty self-explanatory. And then velocity. How long is it taking kind of to move from stage to stage? By tracking those 4 key metrics for each of the stages of the revenue cycle, you start to, and then potentially by business unit, or by, in some cases, by lead type, if you will, you start to get the core metrics that a marketer and a sales executive need to have a common language around discussing the health of the pipeline. You can actually say, oh, I'm forecasting that there will be less pipeline 2 quarters from now because I see the inventory at this stage over here dropping. Right? Think about a marketer who can do that. Right? That marketer, as I said, is a partner and aligned with the head of sales, talking about kind of the future revenue. So it's those 4 key metrics for the revenue stage. I think as a correlation to those, there's one other metric that I think people should look at very closely when measuring the performance of a marketing program. So this is where you're saying, did that marketing activity, did those dollars I spend deliver a reasonable result? And that's the pipeline to spend ratio. I think if there's sort of one metric to rule them all, this would be the one I'd look at in terms of marketing performance. It's pretty simple. It's how much pipeline did that program generate divided by what did I spent on it, or I like to say what I invested in it. To get to that, how much pipeline you generated is a whole sophisticated discussion where I really think you need to look at multi-touch attribution, an allocation of pipeline dollars to all the different touches that affect a deal. But however you ultimately evaluate that pipeline, if you have, what I'd like to see is a 10x ratio. If there's a ratio, when you get that 10x ratio of pipeline to investment, that's a good rule of thumb to say that that investment is returning value that the sales team is accepting into their pipeline at a profitable ongoing ratio for the business. So it's the 4 metrics that matter plus the pipeline to reach. is really what I think people should focus on.
How about the senior marketer and senior sales officer? What should their performance be tied on and the bonuses be tied to in terms of a metric?
Yep. So at the most core level, I think the metric that is best used to measure marketing's performance and actually have bonuses tied to is pipeline creation. And not kind of revenue output. When marketing has their variable compensation tied to pipeline creation, you're really focusing at least that part of the marketing team that's responsible for that job, on the thing that sales cares about, pipeline. Now, I think it's an important nuance. If you're going to tie marketing's compensation to pipeline, you have to have a business process, which is that only the sales team can actually create pipeline. Right? The mistake I see companies often make is say, we're going to compensate marketing on maybe leads passed, right? Not really leads that are accepted by the sales team, and that's too easy to gain, right? So what I'm saying is, if marketing, does something, only their customer, which is sales, can actually say, yep, it's true. Just like a salesperson, right? They do something, only their customer, when they actually sign the contract, can sort of say, you got the credit for that. All right, so that's sort of, the core pipeline creation. Now, you did say the chief marketing officer. And so, really I think pipeline creation is the right metric for certainly part of the chief marketing officer and certainly the team, the demand gen team, right, that's sort of responsible for it. However, there are two other metrics that I think matter kind of at the CMO level. The first is win rate. And, so if you've got this part of the team that's trying to create pipeline, there's a whole part of marketing, which is usually product marketing, right? And a big part of product marketing's job is to enable the sales team to sell more effectively. And so by measuring the win rate, and is the win rate kind of going up or down, I think you're measuring is the product marketing function doing well. And then lastly, a big part of the chief marketing officer's job, I think goes beyond new business pipeline creation and has to do with customer value and long-term customer success. We actually did some research at Marketo that found that the fastest growing, most successful companies had part of their CMO's variable comp tied to Net Promoter Score. Right. So, pipeline is certainly the most important metric for many businesses, but win rate and Net Promoter I think are also really important too.
What practice do you recommend implementing to really to foster the marketing sales alignment process?
I think there are a couple of really important processes that are in place. Probably the single most important one is to model out rigorously the stages of the revenue cycle. I alluded to this a little bit earlier. But by really defining what is a target prospect, and when is a target prospect ready to get called for lead qualification, and when does that get passed to a salesperson, and when does that get turned into an opportunity, and when does it get recycled? When you have those things rigorously defined, and by rigorously defined I mean you ask the head of sales and the head of marketing, they're going to in separate rooms and they give you the exact same answer, right? That's probably the most important thing, because it gives you the ability then to start to understand what the process looks like. It gives you the common metrics that you have. One of the biggest areas of dysfunction that people get into is marketing says, I generated this many leads, right? But that's not what sales would call a lead, right? So they're saying, no, you actually only generated this many leads. That's just terribly broken. Think about if you had a finance department saying, we generated this much revenue, right? And they're, no, you actually only generated this much revenue, right? There's a whole reason we have generally accepted accounting principles, so that there's a single definition of revenue, and companies need that single definition of what's a lead, right? So that's the most important, and it spins off all the metrics and things like that. Once you do that, I think there are a bunch of other processes that start to come into place that are really important. Clearly, companies start to say, well, I need some sort of lead scoring. Because if I'm going to say I'm only passing these things to sales, you're going to write down the rules. What do we pass to sales? And, in a business of any size, you want that automated, right? You want some ability to sort of, say, yep, these people have done this, fast track it, these people haven't. Now, done best, that's got some sort of behavioral component to it too, and that's where market automation fits in. But that's not a requirement here. The requirement is to have solid definitions for each of the stages. Lead scoring. You get into lead nurturing, right? If I'm not passing everything to sales, well, then what do I do with everybody else, right? I need some process for how do I maintain and develop those relationships. When you do identify something as a marketing qualified lead, I see a huge best practice about having a lead qualification function or an inside sales function. We call them at Marketo sales development representatives. But fundamentally, you've got somebody, a function that sits between the demand gen team and the sales team that takes marketing leads and actually has a human interaction to qualify them and determine, is this something I'm going to pass over to the sales team. Probably that's one of the most important things I think a company can do, because that's the handoff, right? It's a great line. Accidents happen at the intersections, right? And at the intersection of sales and marketing is, if you have an SDR, sales development rep, passing the traffic and making sure that everything's flowing properly, you can really improve the overall, situation. And the last process that rigorously defining everything kind of spins off is around service level agreements and then recycling. So there's actually two there. Service level, once you've sort of agreed, okay, when the SDR qualifies something, what's going to happen, you want to make sure that you agreed, oh, we're going to call that person within 5 minutes, or we're going to call them within 24 hours. And if that doesn't happen, these things occur. A reminder happens, and then ultimately maybe the lead gets reassigned. By defining those pieces of, again, it's all just ways of defining the overall process and putting some rigor and some kind of teeth around it. And then, as I sort of alluded to, and then the recycling. So, all right, we didn't move them forward for whatever reason. What's going to happen? How do I make sure it doesn't just sit on the vine? How do I actually bring it back for kind of more development? So, basically define the process, and then if you do that well, there's lots of richness underneath in terms of all these other sub-processes to make that overall process the most effective.
When you put together these teams, who should make up this the marketing sales alignment team, and how should the collaboration unit work functionally?
Mm-hmm. As I sort of alluded to before, fundamentally this needs to start from the top, right? When you have the head of sales and the head of marketing essentially kind of coming together saying we're going to make this overall process better. You can sort of delegate to other people underneath it. I think oftentimes a lot of the core work is from a marketing and sales operations function. In terms of defining the specifics of the processes and the stages, if you have such a function, right? If not, it's just going to be marketing and sales people. I've seen, and that's kind of it in terms of building out the team, getting some of those quick pilot members that are going to kind of experience the whole thing kind of along the way. Now that said, I've seen kind of one other alternative organization that can be remarkably effective when it happens to do this, and that is to not have separate sales and marketing functions. Right? That is to create a single revenue team that reports up to a chief revenue officer. There are definitely companies that are playing around with this org structure. What I don't mean by chief revenue officer is a glorified title for head of sales. That sits next to a chief marketing officer, right? That is still having a sales team and marketing team. What I mean by a chief revenue officer is a single revenue team that happens to have, and that chief revenue officer will have multiple reports, right? So multiple marketing reports and multiple sales reports potentially that kind of align around this. What's cool about that is it lets you start to really dynamically think about moving investments seamlessly between these different, functions. Like, there's not enough pipeline, so with that same dollars, instead of hiring that next salesperson, I'll put that into marketing to generate more pipeline, or vice versa, right? That would never happen with separate sales and marketing teams in terms of actually moving budget around. It can if you have a single revenue team. So, again, to summarize most commonly you have your head of sales, head of marketing, some marketing operations teams, but companies that really want to embrace this can consider the chief revenue officer.
Next one. What trends in marketing sales alignment do you seek for the coming year?
At Marketo, we've talked a lot about a concept that we call revenue performance management. Revenue performance management is essentially the process of continuous measurement improvement to the end-to-end revenue cycle. Just in a very similar way to the fact that Six Sigma was the continuous measurement and improvement to the manufacturing process. As companies really start to think about, I'm going to instrument this thing and then can really provide rigor, right? It sort of makes sense that we spent all the last 15 years applying measurement and rigor and Kaizen to manufacturing and the back end and all these things. Why wouldn't to the supply chain? Why wouldn't we start to apply it to the demand chain? Right now, there's lots of ways that you can start to really think about providing that Kaizen process to your revenue cycle, right? It can mean blowing up the whole sales and marketing function and creating a single revenue team. It can mean just putting in place a lot of rigor around this is what the revenue cycle looks like. These are the definitions of the stages. These are the measurements and metrics, and ultimately being really clear about this is what sales does at this stage and this is what marketing does at this stage. But an important part of it, by the way, isn't handoffs. This is marketing and this is sales. It's about, again, we're working as a collaborative team to move people in as optimal a fashion through this demand cycle, if you will. I think revenue performance management has implications for a lot of things we talked about today in terms of, how do you compensate, the marketing department, really moving them closer and closer and closer to quotas. There's actually an interesting thing that happens as you truly embrace some of these approaches. You're essentially shifting risk from the sales team to the marketing team. What I mean by that is if sales is responsible for all their own pipeline and all their own revenue, all the risk is on them, and they should get paid the big bucks if they achieve their revenue. But as you embrace a revenue performance management, marketing takes on bigger function piece of the overall revenue process. Marketing starts to carry a quota for saying, I'm going to generate this much pipeline. For the sales team, what they're essentially doing is they're taking part of the overall revenue chain risk into their own quota. Because essentially, you're saying if marketing generates their pipeline, then sales just has to win it, right? So I'm not saying sales doesn't have any work to do, but there's a transfer of risk. And so as risk moves from the sales team to the marketing team, the question is, should marketing variable compensation go up? Because with more risk should come more reward, right? Which is pretty cool for marketers. I mean, we see salespeople making big bucks. Why should marketing make similar big bucks with similar risk? Of course, where this gets into the most naughty challenge is you can't just have a higher expectation value for marketing. Do you actually pay salespeople less because you've taken risk off their equation? What actually happens, and you see this in a lot of modern organizations, is you don't pay salespeople less, but you can hire less experienced salespeople, right? Because it's not quite as sophisticated or quite as complicated a selling process, because they're not necessarily doing everything themselves. And so there is an allocation of dollars that sort of happens between the sales and marketing process. And that's just one example of some of the types of things that you think about within sort of this like revenue performance management trend.